My name is Fiona Parkes, and I'm a member of the MPA 2019 group, and I'll play host for this week's policy speakers, which we are fortunate to have Dr. Mel Cappe here to speak with us today. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Indigenous territory on which we have the privilege of meeting today. The territory of Kingston sits on has been the site of human occupation for thousands of years and is a homeland of Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people. Now I would like to introduce Professor of Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, Dr. Mel Cappe. From 2006 to 2011, he was president of the Institute for Research on Public Policy. Prior to that, for 4 years, he was High Commissioner for Canada to the United Kingdom. Before that, he served as clerk of the Privy Council, secretary to the cabinet, and head of the public service in Ottawa. Earlier in his career, he held a senior economic and policy positions in the Department of Finance and Industry. He was Deputy Secretary to the Treasury Board, Deputy Minister of the Environment, Deputy Minister of Human Resources Development, Deputy Minister of Labour and Chairman of the Employment Insurance Committee, and he did his graduate studies in economics at the University of Western Ontario and Toronto, and he's an honorary doctorate from both. And he is an officer of the Order of Canada. We are well aware our world is changing as a result of globalization. This integration and interdependence makes the United Kingdom exit from European Union very difficult, messy, complex, and costly. Dr. Cappe's talk today is sure to get us thinking and evoke questions. As in the past, we will use Slido to ask these questions to Dr. Cappe. For those unfamiliar, you can submit your questions by going to the Slido website directly or using the app on your phone. People watching via live stream can also participate. The code for today is MPA 19. Please ask questions throughout the talk, and they will show on the screen up above. Also, if you don't have a question, still take a moment to vote on others' questions if you are also interested in them. We will also take a few questions live from the crowd today. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Dr. Cappe.
So I have to remember to put on my mic. Thank you very much, Fiona. I call you Fiona because my name is Cap, but I couldn't resist. Look, Fiona's given the perfect setup for me because she began by talking about globalization. And the land and territorial recognition that she cited is apt for this presentation. So I'd ask you to start by thinking, what do you think the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee would have been thrilled if England and their king had wanted to actually exit from their colonies? So this is something which is relevant to my talk today, and I want to just underscore the importance of exit from the UK. So, or of the UK from the European Union. So I'm going to begin. I've got 2 points to this presentation. The first one is, the title is Breaking Up is Hard to Do. And the second point is that there's lots of remorse and regret. So let's start with this, if it works. I want you to listen to the words. You'll see why this is relevant in a minute. My point is the following, that Britain thought this was a simple question. And as Neil Sedaka warned them, breaking up is hard to do. More importantly, and it comes to my point about remorse and regret, instead of breaking up, I wish that we were making up again. And after you go through the breakup, or you prepare for the breakup, it turns out that you're actually not that happy. And you haven't been able to accomplish what you actually set out to do. So, as I said, Fiona had started by talking about globalization, and you've got to look at these two forces that are at work. One is integration and disintegration. That's happening globally, happening worldwide. And in the United Kingdom, we have the disintegration that's taking place with devolution. Westminster is giving authority to to the constituent governments, and they are at the same time being integrated into global supply chains, into more and more ceding of authority to international multilateral organizations and down to local governments, and then also out to multilateral institutions. So that the whole notion of integration and globalization and interdependence is taking place at the same time as nationalism, sovereignty, and the recreation or redefinition of the Westphalian state, nation state. So the trend over time is clearly towards more integration. I mean, think about Victoria, Queen Victoria, who integrated her colonies. And the forces that were at work at that time towards more codependence and more ceding of authority. But at the same time, this sense of nationalism, if you go to the UK and you drive through the countryside, you see the flag of St. George more than, or as much as you would see the Union flag. And so these two forces are at work, and you need to keep them in mind. So what happened in June of 2016? And that was a moment in time where heart took over head, and where the notions of identity and what people felt were important to them was going to be much more important than the actual consequences of Britain leaving the European Union. It was not a rational decision. This is not a rational issue. It's not an issue that tests your analytic ability. It's an issue that goes to your gut and to your heart. And for Britons, the question of whether they should leave the European Union was about how they were going to view their future, but more how they were going to view themselves. So the arguments in favor of Remain had to be emotional. But instead, the arguments in favor of Remain were all analytic and substantive, as they should be. I mean, that's important. We're in a university, we're in a school of policy studies where the analytics actually matter. But nobody's going to, or few people are going to be convinced, except for the MPAs in the room. The public isn't going to be convinced by the basis of the analytics. They're going to be convinced on the basis of the appeal to their heart. This was old England against the rest of the countries. So London, Oxford, and Cambridge, Scotland, and Northern Ireland were on one team, and rural Britons were on the other. And I'll bet you've all got Neil Sedaka going on in your head. But it was the constituent countries of the United Kingdom against old England. And that's why the reference to the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee, I can't say that word, is so relevant, because this is a notion of what, not what the future is, but what identity is. It was also a vote of the old against the young. It was not an intergenerational consensus. The young people overwhelmingly voted for Remain, and old England voted for leaving. And for many of them, it was pining for the good old days. They were pining for empire. They were longing for the days when Victoria was queen and all the pink bits on the map belonged to them. And they would like to go back to that. So one of the things I'd ask you to keep in mind is the extent to which there's magical thinking going on in the part of Britons. Because if this is all about heart over head, then we need to recognize that the consequences are going to be significant, and they don't care. So this is what I'm going to, how I've structured this. I want to talk a bit about the history. I want to then talk about some of the issues and the impacts, and then I'll go through a couple of scenarios of how we proceed. In terms of the history, anybody want to give me a sense of when they think that the debate on Britain leaving the Union, leaving Europe, began? The day after they joined. Actually, it was a few years before, but no, that's exactly right. But I'm actually going to try to put this in a broader historical context. So as I was thinking about this presentation, I started with 1066. Guillaume le Conquérant, okay, William the Conqueror, comes from France and invades that island to the north. And if you've ever seen the Bayonne Tapestry, it's a brilliant piece of art that describes history. And you see that that was the beginning of Europe and the integration of Britain into Europe. But actually, that's not true. Because if any of you have been to Hadrian's Wall, you know that it was actually the Romans who went up there and began the integration of Britain into Europe. And if you keep thinking about it, you realize, no, it was the Anglo-Saxons in the 5th and 6th century BC, or that first brought over Europe to Britain. But no, go back 2500 BC, and it was the Celts. And the Celts who came over to occupy Britain were actually the first part of that integration. And so when we talk about globalization, we talk about it as if it is recent. Not so. Ask Hadrian. I mean, he understood globalization. Now, we've seen this movie before. In 1534, the leaders of Britain, of England, took them out of Europe. They took them out of Rome, not out of Brussels. King Henry VIII said, I'm not going to be subject to the domination of the bureaucrats in St. Peter's. I'm going to set up my own goddamn religion. And I'm going to take England out of the Roman Catholic Church. I don't think he went through the analytics of whether that was a good idea or not. But I do think it appealed to his desire to have an heir and his heart and not his head. So I can go through the other forces of integration, and I won't, but I'll pick up a couple that are of some significance. And the first one should be the integration of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, okay, which actually, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland goes back to 1801, then they lost the Republic, but they kept Northern Ireland, and then the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. That's actually probably the most significant date that is going to put the kibosh to Brexit, okay? That's going to cause Brexit to be the most complicated solution possible. Because the treatment of Northern Ireland, and I'll come back to this, is of great significance. And what the Good Friday Agreement did was remove the formalities at the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. So people cross all the time, every day. Goods cross all the time, every day. And there is no border. You don't know why this farmer's field is in the north and that farmer's field is in the Republic. So the other important date is March 29th, 2017, because that was the invocation of Article 50, which triggered the beginning of a 2-year clock. And there is no way to undo the triggering of that clock. There is no path that says, we'll put a pause on the negotiations. The Lisbon Treaty in 2009 established a process in Article 50 that is bounded and constrained and will have to continue on. There's a line when I was in the UK that I found really fascinating, which explained a lot to me, and that was a line that some people said, when there's fog in the channel, the continent is cut off. As if England and Britain were the center of the universe and the continent were the unusual part of the world. So in the EU, remember that the Europeans were on the receiving end of Francis Bacon. They had Nelson at Trafalgar, beat them. Napoleon lost and was banished to Elba. Remember who it was who brought him down, and that was Wellington. Defeated him at Waterloo. Or was that ABBA at Waterloo? No, I forget now. Bismarck in the 19th century tried to integrate more of Europe. But obviously the wars, First and Second World War, were dramatic events. And the Treaty of Rome brought together, in 1957, the European Economic Commission, which sort of really did start all of this difficulty. So we should keep in mind the extent to which Europe is becoming more and more integrated. The UK joined in '73. In '85, you had Schengen, which allowed for the removal of formalities and borders among the Schengen parties. Some Schengen parties are from outside the EU, and Britain is in the EU and was not a member of the Schengen community. And neither is the Republic of Ireland, so that they could break down that border. The euro was an integrating element, but the UK kept the pound sterling. The Lisbon Treaty of 2009 I mentioned. What I want you to think about is what happened in 2012. In 2012, something happened in Sweden that was of great significance. And it was the Nobel Committee awarding the European Union the Nobel Peace Prize for having brought, after the war, the integration of Europe and peace to the continent. They recognized the significance, the positive significance of the European Union that the Brits want to get out of. So I'm going to now go to a documentary that was done by the BBC, which goes back to 1980, actually. And, sorry, before I do, for those of you who really want to follow up on this, I am in an academic institution, and some of you are scholars and will want to do more research on this. That is the Library of Parliament in the United Kingdom, the research branch of the Library of Parliament, and they have something called Brexit Reading List General Coverage. And it's put together by Eleanor Gadd, and if you Google those words, you'll find it. And it's a brilliant list, 20 pages long, of links that go to think tank research, research by academics, universities, that brings together a whole range of research that's really quite impressive and worth looking at. But now to my documentary. And so I want to just, I'm going to try this again, and we're going to see that this works.
Yes, right, sir. This document comes from Brussels, saying all EEC members must conform to some niggling European word processing standards. They have to agree to the plans of masses of European word processing committees at the forthcoming European Word Processing Conference in Brussels. Well, say so.
Yes, Minister.
Quite so. Is that all you want to say?
But, Minister, I'm afraid that is the penalty we have to pay for trying to pretend that we're Europeans. Believe me, I fully understand your hostility to Europe.
I'm not like you, Humphrey. I'm pro-Europe. I'm just anti-Brussels. I suppose that you're anti-Europe and pro-Brussels.
Minister, I'm neither pro nor anti-anything. I'm merely a humble vessel into which ministers pour the fruits of their deliberation. It will be argued that given the absurdity of the whole European idea, that Brussels is in fact doing its best to defend the indefensible and to make the unworkable work.
That is simply not true. The European idea is our best hope of avoiding narrow national self-interest.
It's okay.
That doesn't sound populist, Minister. Merely inaccurate.
Listen, humble vessel. Europe is a community of nations dedicated towards one goal. Maybe should do it.
Minister, now, let's look at this objective.
This is really important.
Play for national interests always was. Why do you suppose we went in?
To strengthen the brotherhood of free Western nations.
Really? We went in to screw the French by splitting them off from the Germans.
What did the French go into then?
Well, to protect their inefficient farmers from commercial competition.
It certainly doesn't apply to the Germans.
No, they went in to cleanse themselves of genocide and apply for readmission to the human race.
Such appalling cynicism. Well, at least the small nations didn't go into it for selfish reasons.
Really? Luxembourg's in it for the perks. The capital of the EEC, all that foreign money pouring in.
Very sensible central location.
With the administration in Brussels and the Parliament in Strasbourg, Minister, it's like having the House of Commons in Swindon and the civil service in Kettering.
If this were true, why would the other nations be trying to get in?
Such as?
Well, take the Greeks.
Actually, I find it difficult to take the Greek. Minded as I am about foreigners, as you both well know. But not the Levant, an olive mountain and a red cedar lake.
I just don't accept any of this.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Minister. I suppose some of your best friends are Greeks.
No, but the trouble with Brussels is not internationalism, it's too much bureaucracy.
But the bureaucracy is a consequence of the internationalism. Why else would there be an English commissioner with a French director general immediately below him, and an Italian chef de division reporting to the Frenchman and so on down the line?
I agree.
It's like the Tower of Babel.
I agree.
No, it's even worse. It's like the United Nations.
I agree.
Perhaps, if I may interject, you are in fact in agreement.
No, we're not.
Brussels is capitals. You know what they say about the average common market official? He has the organising ability of the Italians, the flexibility of the Germans, and the modesty of the French. And that's topped up by the imagination of the Belgians, the generosity of the Dutch, and the intelligence of the Irish.
So look, that was, I really like that, but it was, I actually showed it to you for a reason, and that is that it gives you a sense of the sentiment that the, I'm on the wrong one, that continues to dominate the way Britons think about, thank you, I've got it, think about the European Union. That was 1980 to 87, when Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister were on. And what it does is it gives you a sense of the really deep down sentiment. I mean, look at satire wherever you are doing your research and think about how they view people in that context, and you'll get a sense of how remarkable some of those deep-seated views are. So I want to actually get into some of the issues, but I want you to keep that Yes Minister piece in mind, because it represents, so back to Ruben's point, they went in 73, that was done in 1980, 7 years later. 40 years after that, or 35 years after that, they're still saying the same things about the Greeks, okay? And certainly the same things about the French. So what I want to do is that these forces that are at work of integration and disintegration, of nationalism that Sir Humphrey manifests, really are overcoming the great man theory or great woman theory of history. And so these are deeply seated views in the psyche of Britons, and that they have a long history indeed. So I've mentioned the Library of Parliament reading list. Now let's turn to some of the issues. The first one is what sovereignty means, and especially sovereignty in the modern Westphalian state. What is it really getting at? And I said earlier that the nation state is ceding authority up to multilateral organizations and down to subnational bodies and out to NGOs and the public at large. And that this is having a significant effect on people's conception of what they want to accomplish. But think about sovereignty over what? What does a nation state have to have control of? And the answer is not everything. Indeed, it never has had total control over everything. However, there are some things that are crucially important to it. And one is territory. Can you control your boundaries? Can you control your borders? Well, let's think about the borders of Great Britain and the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Gibraltar is a territory, an offshore territory of the United Kingdom. The most recent war that Britain fought before Afghanistan was the Falkland Islands. The Falkland Islands are an offshore territory of the United Kingdom. The Channel Islands, Jersey and Guernsey, they're actually not part of the United Kingdom. They aren't even an offshore territory. I went to Guernsey and when I was High Commissioner, and the bailiff of Jersey begins every council meeting in French. They're very close to Saint-Malo. They're literally, you can see Saint-Malo across that part of the channel. And you cannot see the UK. But the governor of, the bailiff of Guernsey and Jersey actually are named by, not the Queen, but by the Duc de Normandie. Now, if you're smart, you're going to ask me, who the hell is the Duc de Normandie? And it turns out that Elizabeth Windsor, since the conquest in 1066, continues to be the Duc de Normandie. But in her dukedom, she appoints the head of government in Jersey and Guernsey. So the Channel Islands are not part of the sovereign United Kingdom. If you control your borders, you've got to stop people from coming in. I know Charlie's going to focus on this. If you don't stop aliens from coming in, you don't control your borders, and what kind of state are you? Certainly, Donald Trump thinks that that's an important issue, and it turns out that a lot of his American populace thinks that too, as we just saw on Tuesday. What about the bendy banana? If you can't control the food that you're going to allow in, you're not much of a nation state. And it turns out that Brussels has a couple of iconic regulations that are enormously important in this debate. The first is the bendy banana. And it says that the arc of a banana can only be up to a maximum of this many degrees. And if it comes further than that, it's not accepted. Now, it turns out, to my astonishment, Canada has a bendy banana rule too, because we control the quality of food. So the idea that that the European Union would have regulations about food quality shouldn't surprise us. And they exclude bendy bananas. But if you were Boris Johnson or Michael Gove during the Brexit debate, the bendy banana represented the dominance of bureaucrats in Brussels. It didn't represent anything like food quality regulation. The other, there are other food quality elements here, but I won't go into them. Conservative Party politics. When David Cameron threw the dice and said, we're going to have a debate. It had nothing to do with politics in Britain. It had everything to do with politics in the Conservative Party. He was trying to keep together his coalition of people who were skeptical about the role of Europe within the Conservative Party. And if Margaret Thatcher had been Prime Minister at the time, she would have tolerated it. But now Jeremy Corbyn, the head of the Labour Party, is anti-Europe as well. And so the politics of Brexit are complex and complicated. But, pardon me, the future of this debate is going to depend on what happens from Theresa May, Prime Minister May, controlling the people of her party more than the public of Britain. Referenda. A referendum is a bad idea. We've spent 2,000 years working towards representative government. We recognize that the complex questions of modern government require people to study them, to understand the implications and consequences, to go into deep detail, and that it takes sophisticated, complex solutions to these problems to make a country better off. So let's ask a yes or no question. You've got this enormously complex question about the future of Britain in Europe, and we ask them yes or no. Should we be in or should we be out? We don't say, can we make it better? We don't say, should we use all our instruments in the Council of Europe to improve the quality of the European Union? We say, should we be in or should we be out? The more complex these questions are, the less I trust the public, and the more I trust the elites. I am an inveterate elitist, and yes, I'm probably a member of the elite. But we've spent a long time, I said Rome, maybe we should only consider the last 1,000 years, only since the Magna Carta, have we really been focused, or 800 years, on this evolution of representative democracy, to study complex problems, to have a process of coming to judgment, a deliberative process where we take the complex issues and bring them together. And what we observe in this coming to judgment now, in the debate of 2017, or 2016 rather, was that people tended to vote on something else. They voted against London. They voted against young folks. They voted against Brussels. One of the problems of process is that you can't control the votes or the lies. There was this iconic double-decker bus painted on the side. It said 350 million pounds that we now send to Europe, we will put into the NHS. 350 million pounds a week. Okay? It turns out you actually get something for the 350 million pounds a week. And it turns out it's a lot less, it's more like 100 million pounds a week, but you can't debate these questions. Lies dominate, fake news, et cetera, et cetera. There's no leadership that is prepared to stand up for, I mean, the head of the Remain program was a former Blairite minister. And this was an aspirational vote for the return of empire, et cetera. So this whole issue of a referendum raises the question of whether you're going to get a rational conclusion, or is this a way of bringing out all these intemperate, hateful feelings and emotions and making it more emotional? And I would argue that's what happens. Let me turn to this question of complexity. I remember when Professor Wolf asked me, how many trade negotiators do you think the UK has? And the answer is 0, because it's a competence that exists in Brussels for the Union. The European Union does all the trade negotiations. So the competence, I used to run I used to be the ADM responsible for bankruptcy law in Canada. And the UK hasn't had bankruptcy law since 1973. It's a delegated responsibility, intellectual property law. A whole range of other things that they have no capacity because they have no competence. I don't mean competence in capability, I mean competence in the sense of capacity. Border officers and customs agents. Yes, if you fly into Heathrow, there's a customs officer there to make sure that you don't have legalized cannabis in your briefcase. But if you're shipping stuff from France, there is no customs officer. You just ship stuff. It turns out 2 lorries out of 180 that cross the channel get searched or even challenged to look at the papers. If that increases as a result of Brexit to 2 minutes per lorry, there will be lorries backed up to Italy. So this is not something that's simple because they don't even have officers, customs agents, who can manage that. Air transport's another one. Foreign policy is a little complicated because, as you know, Britain sits, or UK sits as one of the P5 members on the Security Council. But they actually have the competence for foreign policy and security policy in Brussels. And so that's a shared responsibility. University research. Here we are in a university that gets a lot of money from Queen's Park and from Ottawa. And you raise a lot of it yourself. But in the UK, most of the university research money comes from Europe. So that £350 million a week is going into good stuff. One of the clever things that Theresa May has done is the Great Repeal Bill. It essentially repealed all the existing legislation that would be relevant to Europe and imported all of the European rules and regulations so that they would apply pending abolishment and repeal after Brexit. But there's no time to be able to manage anything else in the UK. This is a dominating policy conversation. The Irish border. There's a minority government for Theresa May. She needs the support of the Democratic Unionist Party of Northern Ireland. If you go violate the Good Friday Agreement and put formalities at the 6 counties and the Republic, you're going to end up aggravating the DUP, the Unionists. That's going to be a problem. That won't be a problem. That'll piss off Sinn Féin. If you put the border at the Irish Sea, that will piss off the DUP. And so you're going to reopen hostilities if you can't solve this problem. It could trigger more Scottish independence, and there's a discussion about a transition period. There's a backstop to the Irish border solution, which Dominic Raab has said, the Minister for Brexit, we will abrogate in 3 months after it's implemented. The transition period for Brexit is going to be decades. It's going to take a huge amount of time to put this in place. On mobility, what's going to happen to the Polish plumbers? You cannot convince me that Welshmen are going to want to become plumbers. You cannot convince me that the Slovenian waitresses are going to give up jobs to the Scottish lassies. There's a reason why Britons won't do these jobs. It's because they're done by foreigners. The economic effects. Now I'm going to turn rational. Every estimate of GDP effect of Brexit by the Economist Intelligence Unit, Standard & Poor's, and the OECD shows that this will be a permanent decline in GDP by 3 to 8 percentage points. 3 to 8% in perpetuity, forever, lost, gone. Investment. Investment is down significantly already. Foreign direct investment is down by some 20%, causing a decline in GDP of about 3%. EasyJet has announced that it's moving its headquarters to Austria, even though it's based in the UK. Toyota is shutting down production in Derbyshire and moving to the continent. The estimate by the Parliamentary Library is that it will cost Britons about £2,700 a year on average. The City of London may end up losing big time to Frankfurt, and the Germans want desperately to take over the central role that the City of London as a financial capital has been. The pound has dropped, and so the British economy has been staying fairly robust, and they haven't noticed it yet, but foreign goods are more expensive. The government issued 105 technical papers on how to prepare for no deal. To tell the public, expect that there's no deal, you better prepare for it. Tariffs and non-tariff barriers. I've talked about bendy bananas and other regulatory checks. There's an estimate that the EU and US are estimated to add 20% to the costs of imports from each other as a result of regulatory inconsistencies. That's the direction that Britain is going in. The EU has 82 trade agreements with other countries. Britain is going to have to negotiate 82 trade agreements with other countries. Part of the solution to Northern Ireland is to separate goods from services. They'll have a customs union on goods, and they'll have segregated restrictions on services. How do you keep services out of your country? Usually, we've seen it go the other way. This is where we're going to see them have a customs union and free open borders on goods and restrictions on services. And that's the checkers solution that Theresa May has talked about. Supply chains, just-in-time delivery, aerospace industry, Airbus, Bombardier, all the wings for the Q400 that Bombardier just sold to Viking in the West Coast are made in Belfast. It's going to be very complicated. 56% of the cars in the UK are exported to the EU. 70% of agricultural imports from of British agricultural imports come from the EU. 60% of agricultural exports go to the EU, etc. I could talk about the effects on Canada, but I won't. Sovereignty is the essence of this. That's what they're buying. I'm not going to play this one. It basically explains why Brits love Europe and hate Europe, and it's all about the content of a Euro sausage, a British sausage. So what are the scenarios that one can imagine? The first is a deal that Barnier and Rob or May negotiate, and it's approved by Parliament. That probably will proceed, and I'd say this is a likely outcome, but not the likely outcome. But I would be afraid of parliamentary backlash because they talk about a Canada plus, plus, plus. Do you know when the negotiations on the comprehensive economic and trade agreement between Canada and the EU began? I mean, it's purported to be a 5-year negotiation, and it was an intensive 5-year negotiation. But Roy McLaren, when he was Minister of Trade, you all remember Roy McLaren as Minister of Trade, don't you? Started those negotiations about 2 decades ago. And so you're not going to get deals with other countries in quick time. The second possibility is that there's a deal negotiated by the EU and the UK, and then it gets defeated in Parliament. Parliament has been found to have the capacity and the responsibility to pass judgment on this. That could lead to a second referendum, but it's very unclear what would happen. And basically, this is a hard Brexit. This means that the deal's off. There's no way to untrigger Article 50. And by the way, the European countries could abrogate this. Remember what happened with the Wallonians, okay? The Walloons almost put the kibosh to CETA, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with Canada and the EU, by saying Belgium couldn't accede to it. you've got to get all 27 other member countries to agree. What happens if there's no deal? This is the hard Brexit solution. Border formalities will be urgently implemented. Medicines are expected to be in short supply because they won't have regulations to import them. All the approvals are made in Brussels. Airline chaos is what's expected because they haven't got authorities to send airplanes to each other. There'll be lorries in a car park on the M25. That's what's expected if there's no deal. This is a terrible thing. However, there are many ways to get to no deal. What happens if Theresa May is pushed by Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg out of the leadership of the party? Remember, this happened to Margaret Thatcher. She was actually quite popular, but she got pushed out and John Major became Prime Minister. Internal chaos of the Tory party brings chaos to government. What happens if, when the DUP reads the draft agreement, they bring the government down? They just had a budget. It was a confidence motion. It will pass. It's not a problem. But then Tony Blair comes back, and you get Blair and Brown, and David Cameron has been musing that he's going to go back into politics. I don't think that's the solution. And then Blair is pushing the second referendum. All a great idea. Good luck with that. Who's going to defend? Which political party is going to push for Remain on the second referendum? The answer is not much. Finally, rag the puck. Just play it out. But remember, the clock is ticking. March 29th, okay, the due date for the papers in my course, is the date that Britain crashes out of the European Union with no deal, et cetera, et cetera. Variations on the theme. So, what did people think? I'm going to conclude. This just shows you here how varied the polls were going into Brexit. The dotted line is the vote in June of 2016. And they picked the moment. You remember when Bernard Landry, may he rest in peace, said, we'll wait for, what did he call it, convenient circumstances. Necessary conditions, winning conditions. Well, they had winning conditions. But look what's happened to the Leave support since. It's dropped off. That's only as of June, and lately even more so. So, I will conclude by saying that there is a lot of remorse and regret in the UK. They wish they weren't in this circumstance, but they are. And to compliment Neil Sedaka, we have okay, I've made my point. I won't go on. It is fascinating to see that the challenge for Britain is to have a solution which recognizes the complexity of what they have to do. Breaking up is hard to do. And recognize that times change and people's views change. Now, I've failed because I had hoped to go for the full hour and not allow for questions. But unfortunately, there's 10 minutes left. So. Slido,
yeah. All right, thank you so much, Dr. Cappe. Our first question is, Western societies are going through a wave of protectionism. How sustainable will this be? Do you think it's just a phase?
So the answer is it's unsustainable. I mean, I was arguing that the trend, the long-run trend, is for more integration. But this is a reality we have to face. So what's happening in the US, what's happening in the UK, and what we're seeing in other places, like Hungary for that matter, is an antipathy to globalization. And we need to figure out how to deal with the consequences of globalization to counter protectionism.
Okay. Is there a role for a second referendum?
Yeah, I don't think there is. And there's a view that, first of all, I've said you can't untrigger Article 50, so the clock's ticking anyway. Jeremy Corbyn is anti-Europe, the head of the Labour Party. Theresa May is anti-Europe, and she's got these splits within her cabinet. I don't see who's going to argue for Remain from an institutional perspective. So I'm actually very pessimistic about a second referendum as a solution. And having an old, I was going to say an old fart, but I won't say it, an old prime minister come out and lead it will not be helpful.
So the next question is, do you think the UK adopting a federal model would be a way to get through the consequences of Brexit?
That's a really interesting question. I haven't thought about it in that way. However, I have been absolutely opposed to all the devolution that Britain has gone through. I think that they had the benefit of a unitary state and have devolved responsibilities to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And in Northern Ireland, it's on and off. But we haven't seen the benefits of a federal regime in terms of innovation and creativity and new ideas that can be copied by the others. And there's no English government. So Westminster is for the United Kingdom. Scotland has a devolved administration, Northern Ireland and Wales. Nobody does England. I don't think that is a solution. I think it's a complicating factor, though. So some of the competences that have been delegated, have been ceded to Brussels and the European Union are actually competences that have been devolved to Scotland. So Scotland runs its own National Health Service. The NHS is only England. The justice system is only England and Wales. So, the Chief Justice, as she then was, Beverly McLaughlin, gave a brilliant lecture on this, on the role of a bijudicial system that Canada has, with a common law and a civil law, and actually the UK has the same. That's a complicating factor. I don't think it's a solution.
We'll actually just take some questions from the audience. Does anyone from the audience have any? Yeah?
What motivates Boris Johnson?
Ambition. I mean, he wants to be prime minister.
But he'll be prime minister of a failed state.
Well, I agree with you, but I don't think he cares. If he gets to live in number 10, he'll be happy. I can't understand. I happen to know his father and his wife, or former wife, now. And he's a fascinating character, Boris Johnson. I mean, we should get some psychiatrists to do some analysis of this. But he is a brilliant analyst. He writes beautifully and is very, very smart. So you can't dismiss him. And I can't understand what motivates him beyond ambition. So good question. I don't know.
All right, so next question on Slido. Was Brexit inevitable?
I think it was, in the sense that, as I was saying at the beginning, this is the low-grade fever of British politics. It's always been there, and it will always be there. It will not go away. And I think whether this model was inevitable, I mean, when they created Article 50, I think they thought they were giving a sop to the anti-Europeans, but they thought it would never be triggered and never used. Whereas now they're finding, my God, it's real. We're going to have to live with it. So I would say it was inevitable. They thought it wouldn't happen. I think the consequences for the Wallonia, for the Basques, for all of the Catalan sentiments of independence, I mean, this is going to have reverberations for a very long time. Was this version of Brexit inevitable? I don't think so.
Okay. How much of an economic mobility, Irish conflict discount is the average leaver Brit prepared to accept in exchange for sovereignty?
So, I mean, if I were a Brit, I'd say zero. Maybe I'd say $1.50 or £1.50. But I wouldn't say very much. It turns out the Brits are prepared, or at least the Leavers are prepared, to ignore the economic consequences and the real income loss and the higher probability of unemployment and the reduced opportunities of working abroad. And so they're prepared to pay a very high discount, it turns out. I don't get it, but evidence is not on my side.
What do you think is the sovereign's view?
I bet that Her Majesty is ambivalent as well as most Britons are. Remember, she can trace her lineage back a long way and has European roots. Remember, she became Windsor, her grandfather became Windsor because he was a Saxe-Coburg, right? So they've got lineage back into Europe. But she's a nationalist. So I bet she wants to keep, the answer to that question is, I think, the answer that was given by the Quebec comedian who, when asked, who said, you know what Quebecers really want? They want an independent Quebec in a strong and united Canada. That's what Britons really want. They want an independent United Kingdom in a strong Europe. And that's what if you go back to that 4-minute segment of Yes Minister, you saw that tension, Of course we're Europeans, but of course we don't want to be European.
I'll take some more questions from the audience.
You seem to treat Europe as homogeneous and stable, and yet within the last few years we've seen populist governments in Poland, Hungary, and now Italy. There's the division between North and South. There's the question of the Ukraine and Turkey and how they fit in. Surely these have an impact on the future of Britain's relationship with Europe.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And the little artifice of the device of pretending that there's a homogeneous Europe was necessary for me to do that in 50 minutes, as opposed to the 30 they gave me. But you're absolutely right. The homogeneity of Europe, for that matter, the homogeneity of the United Kingdom, the heterogeneity of the United Kingdom and of Europe is something that you have to take into account. So you mentioned Turkey. I mean, remember, Turkey is in NATO, but it's not in the EU. And every time Turkey has tried to get into the EU, the Europeans have pushed them back. And they push them towards Asia. And so if Turkey is the bridge of being both in Asia, one foot in Asia, one foot in Europe, the Europeans are saying, no, we're happy to have you as a Muslim nation. We're happy to have you as an Asian country. We wouldn't really want you as a European country, which is virtually what they've said. And we need to recognize that even within Turkey, there are these forces at work that are integrating into Europe and disintegrating even within Turkey. So when you said the North and the South, you meant, I think, Northern Europe and Southern Europe. You had just mentioned Italy. Even within Italy, the North and the South within Italy is of different views, and the Northern League is part of that populist movement. So you're absolutely right. We need to take that into account. I think that's a hugely complicating factor for Brexit, because if Michel Barnier actually gets a deal and has a solution, then I'm not convinced he can sell it to the 27 countries. And he has to do that.
Can we take one last question from the audience? Or I'll move back to Slido. Yeah.
We're talking about the side of the UK. How is the Brussels, the EU, responding to that break?
They're ambivalent as well, I think. I mean, you see, first of all, they don't really give a damn. I mean, the premise that anybody in Europe, in the continent, wakes up and thinking about this every day is just wrong, except for Michel Barnier and his team. But then within some of the countries, there are people in each of the ministries in the capitals that do think about this and do worry about this. My sense would be that some Europeans would be happy to see the Brits go. But think about all the Brits who have summer homes in Spain, and all the Slovenians who have daughters working in restaurants in London. There's a lot of integration there, and they do care at a fundamental level if you press them, but nobody wakes up in the morning thinking, oh God, what's going to happen with Brexit?
Wonderful. Well, on behalf of the MPA class and everyone here, I would just like to thank you so much for your talk today. It was incredibly insightful.
Thank you. Thanks, Fiona.